Okay, we don't have the questions yet, but well, all right, somebody will come around and collect it. Well, I want to pick up with this, Rob, because I want to ask you if the failure of Obama, ostensibly the liberal here who's going to let the air out of the tires to save capitalism, the failure for Obama to seek any accountability from the bankers, to unwind the crisis in a way that would have helped people in their homes first, as opposed to helping the banks and hoping that they would do the right thing. Does that create more of the context for this type of realization amongst Americans, as opposed to, say, you know, those Republicans, this is what they do. We just need to get a liberal into office.
Chris Hedges, in his book, Twilight of the Elites, he and I talked about it a lot. And he says in the opening pages that I'm a traitor to my class, because I was a hedge fund manager and how I say, qualified for the 1%. And I said to him, you got that wrong. I think these people are going to destroy themselves. And that inability, like Roosevelt, of them to conserve the system. When, as Chris talked about, they didn't do any policies that were accommodative, they used coercion, they lead me back to an awareness of when I was sitting in Zuccotti Park talking to a young man one night, and I asked him, I said, are you scared? He said, yeah. And I said, well, why are you here? He said, because I'm more scared not to do this. And everything that's been done to help the banks and not the people, to use force and not accommodate on mortgages or food or student loans, fortifies that resolve, that I'm more scared not to protest. So this isn't going to end until something changes. And these people are pouring gasoline on the flames. And maybe there's a hubris where they think they can use coercion and everybody will end up going home and going away. But I actually think there's a tradition in this country over a couple hundred years. It's going to be hard to wring out of everyone's mind and heart. So that they are not playing a coherent endgame.
Do we have those questions, or? Okay, well, well, I'll ask, Patrick, you mentioned the unions. Where are the unions? Are they revolting or are they giving in?
I'm sorry,
Are they revolting or giving in?
I mean, I don't even know if I'm qualified to answer that, but I think the bigger issue is really like, what percentage of the workforce in this country is actually unionized now? 12%, and less than that of the private workforce? I mean, I think at this point, that's the bigger over decades kind of tidal change that we've seen, and speaks very much to these major structural changes we've seen, the stagnation of wages and incomes over the last 30 years, along with the explosion of wealth and income at the top 1% and 0.1%. I mean, that structural change, I think, speaks to that. I think the question is going to be when organized labor is ready to go and organize what's really the working class in this country, the retail workers, home health aides, like all these folks that are, what's left. It's not the manufacturing workers anymore. It's not public sector workers alone anymore. It's what's left of the working class in this country.
Do either one of you think there's any capacity for unions to, I mean, it seems that they function on a very narrow playing field, that they're not necessarily representing labor as much as they are unions?
Well, first of all, they're a spent force. I mean, you only have 4% of the American workforce is in manufacturing. Only 12% of the labor force in the country is unionized. Most of that is in public sector unions. I think we were just talking, it's only 4% that are not in public sector unions. And of course, what we're seeing, especially with the recent Supreme Court decision, is an assault to destroy public sector unions. I live in the state of New Jersey, and this is Chris Christie's great crusade against police unions. And you're right, the cops are next. It's against teachers' unions. And the problem is that, you know, and this goes back to the destruction of the radical and progressive movements that began in World War I. So that by the time you see the rise of the New Left in the 1960s, you have the AFL-CIO supporting Nixon's war in Indochina and denouncing the hippies in the street. It used to be that if you went to the coalfields of southern West Virginia, the hero was Mother Jones. Now it's Michelle Bachmann. And the reason is because labor essentially, as you point out, Sam, essentially became a kind of junior partner in the corporate state. They protected their own, and of course now, you know, what they're doing is making more and more concessions. I mean, for instance, new workers who come into the workforce are not going to be protected so that the old workers can be. They're shriveling up and dying.
They're going down below decks, getting their jewels.
And this is very frightening because most social movements throughout history have counted on the backbone of labor. But we don't have it. That has been taken away from the equation, which makes it much more difficult. And I'll just conclude by saying, let's not forget that this can go the wrong way. Just as in Europe in the 1930s, it went the wrong way. Right-wing populism, and we see it in the Tea Party, we see it in the Christian right, which is proto-fascist. It celebrates the gun culture. It celebrates the language of violence. It does what fascist movements do, which is funnel a legitimate rage and a legitimate sense of betrayal against the vulnerable, against the poor, against undocumented workers, against Muslims, against homosexuals, against feminist intellectuals. They got a very long list of hate. And they are bankrolled by the most retrograde forces in American society, the Koch brothers and others. And the longer you have political paralysis, which is essentially what has happened, the more you empower these extremes. And there is a very dark undercurrent of violence in this country. And we cannot exclude the fact that these forces may be given life. I spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America. I was trying to reach out to them. And I come out of seminary, and these are quintessentially fascist movements in every sense of the word. And they are very powerful, and they have severed tens of millions of Americans from the mainstream. Everything they see is reflected through the lens of this very dark and perverted ideology. So I think that the breaking of labor, which was quite conscious on the part of the capitalist corporate class, is something that has severely weakened us, because you go into towns like Ohio, and instead of a labor hall being the center of activity, it's a megachurch.
And Rob, do you want to add?
I just would add a reference. The management theorist Peter Drucker, first book, which he couldn't get published for 7 or 8 years, was called The End of Economic Man. And it was a discussion of Germany and how principles and all aspects of humanity were eventually forfeited in despair to restore order. And when you read that book, which has been reprinted in recent years, you can buy it on Amazon or get it at the Strand or what have you. Yeah, well, I don't. Yeah, you get them to order for you. But the idea that's contained in that dysfunction and how it's resolved resonates with the feeling you have as you drive around the United States right now. Probably some of the towns that you studied in your most recent book.
Sorry, can I add something on that as well? Just, I mean, because I think it's an interesting question, because I think the underlying part about unions is just political infrastructure in general. Young people aren't unionizing, and I think that the question is, like, what is the next iteration of political infrastructure that people can plug into to be able to build the movements that we need? I don't think that question's been answered, and I think both unions and then people who aren't in unions need to think about what that looks like. I mean, that's a driving idea behind the Campus Network and Pipeline, which is our network for young workers and young professionals, is that the political infrastructure is not there anymore, and whether it's in unions or whatever comes next, it's going to be critical for moving a lot of these things forward.
Sam, let me just add one other thing. Just this past week, Dick Ravitch and Paul Volcker put out a report on state and municipal finances and the crisis that they're in. underpinning all of this is, as you mentioned, the churches are organizing on the right. It's these municipal governments and their unions and their employees that are essentially the network of the progressive side in this country. And the constriction of federal finances, when 1 out of every $3 in a state or municipal government is a transfer from the federal government, the constriction at the federal level has put all of these places in crisis. You're reading about it in California right now. The dismantling of another layer of progressive resistance and infrastructure, teachers and firemen and police and whatever, is really what you might call going to intensify this darkness and this loss of backbone.
And we've already lost 600,000 plus jobs in the past 3 years of basically state municipal workers, which is not only is significantly below where we've been at any other recession, regardless of who was, and not just in terms of losses, but this time in the Bush administration and the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration following the recession, we were up 300, 600,000, in some cases even more in terms of those.
Decompose job growth and loss across recessions. That is the big difference.
That's the big drag on the economy on some level. It's the austerity that's happening, as well as the tremendous amount of wealth that's been destroyed.
But this goes back to your earlier question: did the 2008 crisis unmask, or did it? Is it just an intensification? And we saw that 30 years before the financialization of capital, everything that happened during that period to create the bubble and the crisis. But we've also seen corporate capital now looking for profiteering in the public sector in a way that it hadn't before. I mean, the privatization of prisons, the privatization of the social services sector that I talked about. Now the hedge funds attacking public school teacher unions and
Peter
making money off the public
school. Peter Orszag had a
school.
piece today in the Times saying that we should privatize the post office in one of the most egregious op-eds I think I've read since Tom Friedman wrote his last op-ed.
I want to interject one question for the audience to consider. We have a Federal Reserve, our central bank, which makes zero interest loans to banks. They also do things, as Matt Taibbi's pointed out, like give loans to the wives of Wall Street executives to go out and buy mortgage securities and make a windfall. But they are not extending credit to places like California, Illinois, New York, so that those services must be cut off. And we have this ethic in the market mantra that we don't pick winners. Right now, our central bank is picking winners and losers, and that's something that deserves a heck of a lot of scrutiny.
I think we have time for one more, and this, I guess, well, I'll read the question, but isn't the fault line for change likely when the price of oil truly goes through the roof and all the rest of the economic activity begins to collapse as a result? So I guess the question is, are we primed for another type of financial crisis that is acute? I mean, we're going through one now that is sort of a slow, if not slow, like immediately medium rapid boil, I guess. But are we just closer to the point of another massive type of economic crisis from any number of factors than we are to people just saying, oh my God, I realize now we're getting totally screwed? Sure.
I think we're in an extremely precarious and vulnerable condition, which the unmasking of these years has revealed. It's been there. It's been growing on people for a long time, but not. This is really fascinating. I sit on the board of the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, and they do a wonderful document called The State of Working America, and they have been writing and screaming about increasing inequality probably since about 1983. And it took Occupy to get the press to recognize these facts that had been building for 30 years. And so I guess what I would say is you get a spike in oil and it causes dysfunction. And it's just a further unmasking of how incoherent things are when you think of all the time in which we could have prepared with taxes or subsidization of alternative energy. I mean, economists are a little wired funny because they think if something has a zero price, it has no value. Try turning off the water or the oxygen. They'll pay you a lot to turn it back on. And we're in a system right now which dependence on markets isn't producing results that sustain this planet. And an oil spike can tip over what you might call the old way of doing things. But we really need a threshold change. And I think the crisis is there whether oil goes up or not.
Okay, I mean, I think we have time, just if there's any final comments that you guys want to add at all.
Put the inexperienced person first.
Rob? Okay.
I am sure, no matter how hard I try, I am only the second best Robert Johnson to tell you you're at a crossroads. And yet, I often think about what gives life meaning. And I think the crisis is evident within all your spirits and throughout the nation and throughout the world. And at some level, I often recite Cornel West's book on Democracy Matters, where he said there are three things you got to have. You have to have prophetic witnesses. You have to have the humility to have a Socratic sense of questioning and not act as though you already know. And the third is you have to have a tragicomic sense of a bluesman, of a blues artist. And so I'll stick with my name for that. I think this is a tremendous time of opportunity. And perhaps to illustrate that, I would encourage you to watch Chris Hedges on YouTube and on Bill Moyers over time. Because I perceive, and we just met tonight for the first time, I perceive a focus and a purpose in your spirit, that you realize the time is now. There is meaning now. There is action. There is a way to make a difference. And for an awful lot of years, people who had a prophetic state of mind like yourself probably didn't see that window. So I want to finish. My last thought is to encourage you all to engage now, because I do think you can make a difference. We are at the crossroads.
I mean, I guess I would only say it's, as I said earlier, sometimes it's a little depressing when I'll go to speak to a university audience or high school audience and realize that I'm talking to a group of folks who grew up in the United States where mass homelessness was an everyday feature of urban life. It was something you expected to see. It wasn't surprising to see an absolutely impoverished person standing on your street corner, without a home. And how, and when you think about it, how vital home is. It's the place that you go back to nurture yourself and to kind of revive yourself at the end of every day. It's the place that's sort of the center of your life, and to not have that and what that means to take that away from people. So as I said, it becomes, it can be a depressing reality to think this is a huge, feature of American life that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. At the same time, working with the folks that we work with and seeing what the struggles that they go through every day and just how incredible the resiliency and the kind of will to survive and will to get through is. And then, I take some hope from what we saw in Occupy, just the glimmer of it there, and some of what Chris said earlier about how there's going to be a spark at some point, and the folks that we work with, I think, are absolutely waiting for that spark and waiting to get involved, and are getting involved and are doing activism, on the very local level, fighting for better conditions at the shelter that they're staying at, or fighting for, housing relief to be able to escape the shelter system, but looking also for something, I think, a bigger fight to be a part of.
Taylor?
Yeah, so I think when you look at social movements throughout history, young people have always played a critical part. I think because there's this boldness that you have when you don't have that much to lose. And I think there's also a creativity and a visioning that is allowed because you don't know quite yet what's possible. And I think if we continue to tap into that, there's a lot that this generation has to offer. We've seen it abroad. You've seen it in Egypt. You've seen it in Tunisia. We've seen it start here. And I think the point with this generation is, can we make that happen? And so I think that the thing that I would say to the audience members who may not be within the 1983 to 2003 age range is that I'm sure a lot of you guys are organizers, have done organizing work. You have to meet people where they're at. Listen to this generation and what they're saying, because if you can tap into what their passions are, what their concerns are, and then give them a platform to vocalize that as a part of this conversation and inform it with the knowledge that is out there, that is a recipe for success. And so that would be my kind of call to action there, is talk to the people that are in this age range, because they want to listen and then they want to act upon what you guys can do together.
The process that we're undergoing is about the recovery of an ethic. We saw powerful forces of propaganda on Madison Avenue destroy American culture, values of self-effacement, thrift, and replace it with this drive for consumption as a kind of inner compulsion, this cult of the self, this hedonism. And I think that part of the almost unmentioned power of the Occupy movement is that it challenged this corporate belief system, this notion that it's about us. It understood, as Martin Buber did in I and Thou, that in the end it's not ultimately, if we care about a coherent society, us at all. It's about our neighbor. And in biblical terms, we betrayed our neighbors. We betrayed the people of color, African Americans in places like East New York. We betrayed indigenous cultures on Pine Ridge. We betrayed the coal miners in West Virginia, just as we have betrayed undocumented workers. And I look at what's happening as a kind of reawakening of moral values. And understanding that if we want a society that works, we can't abandon our neighbor anymore.
Well, I want to thank all the members of our panel and remind you that Chris will be signing Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt in, I believe, in the lobby there. And thanks for coming out tonight. You guys were great.